Hey guys, Trevor here. I wanted to hop on here and make this video really quick. I want to make it known right off the bat that the point of this video is not to criticize, degrade, or push down the pilot in this video. I have nothing but respect for the individual who was flying in this video, and again, I'm only making this for educational purposes. I hope the pilot is recovering well. I hope he is okay. I don't think he has posted about the injuries he sustained or if he even sustained any injuries in the first place. I only want to make this video as an educational video to help clear the air as to exactly what happened in this flight. So let's first watch the crash and then I'm going to break it down. All right, guys, let's break down this video. The first thing that I want to point out is the conditions. We notice that the sun is down near the horizon. That is indicating that it is in the evening time. We don't have a lot of clouds off in the horizon, and the pilot is doing a forward inflation, what appears to be very light winds. So we have an evening flight, arguably very good conditions. The pilot even mentioned nil winds, no wind inflation. All around, the sky should be very nice. So we can immediately rule out the possibility of rotor, wind shear, and thermals, as well as potential gust fronts, meaning that this pilot did not encounter any fluke, weird, strange, predicted, or unpredictable turbulence in the sky. We watched the pilot do an inflation, appears to be a very sluggish inflation in the sense that it was very, very light winds. He also was running very fast and needed a lot of brake to help him get off the ground. Upon lifting up, you can see he pulled quite a bit of brake, ballooning into the sky. Now, I only want to mention that for one reason. When you pull brake, when you pull both brakes like that, when you burn energy with the wing, the energy needs to be put back in the glider. So this pilot took off and pulled both of those brakes, initiating a steeper climb out on his takeoff. Well, that's okay as long as you let the wing regain energy and take a breath, which he did. You can see the wing leveled back out and then would begin to climb straight had he not turned. But it took that breath and it regained the energy that it had burned. The reason that I'm pointing that out is because that's energy management. You use the energy, you let the wing regain the energy, and then you use the energy again, which is going to be something important that we'll talk about here in just a second. So the pilot begins a right turn, which he let the wing regain that energy. And I want to point a couple things out about this right turn. You can see the pilot lost a little bit of altitude and was at full throttle. The reason that those two things are important is because, number one, full throttle. Full throttle indicates that the glider will have just built up quite a bit of energy in that turn. Number two, he lost altitude in the turn, meaning he dove down, which is going to build additional energy. Now, here he is in this turn, has a bunch of additional energy, and there's a few things he can do with it. He can burn that energy upward, he can continue the turn around until it slowly bleeds off, or he can snap it around to the other side. What the pilot ultimately chose to do, if we continue watching, was to burn the energy upward, which is an okay thing to do. There's two main ways of burning energy. The first one is exiting upward. The second one is turning slowly until it bleeds off. Exiting upward is okay. In fact, it's a totally fine way of burning energy in which he just built. However, your glider right here where he is in a compromised state, meaning this glider is not full of energy, or we could say it's not full of air. Right now, this glider is sitting at, and this is not the exact amount, but it's sitting somewhere around the 50%, hypothetically, full of air spot. We just burned off a lot of that energy going upward. That glider now needs to redive, just like it did off takeoff, only more now. It needs to redive to regain energy, which then the pilot can use. And oftentimes pilots use, quote unquote, this energy by applying brake, which initiates a turn. Well, In this situation, the pilot right here applies very heavy brake. Now, if you apply very heavy brake when the wing is very light on energy, it's light on air, what happens, and ultimately what did happen, if we keep watching, is that the pilot then spins the glider. Right here where I have the frame paused, the glider is now entering into a spin. A spin is a negative maneuver, meaning that the glider is no longer flying. It is stalled. And a spin happens because you pull so much brake that you kind of, in some way, we could describe it this way, suck the air and energy out of the glider. He pulled so much of that left brake in a compromised moment where that wing is light on energy to where he spun the left half of the glider and the right half also followed suit. So now he has a stalled glider. If we continue to watch, we can see this wing enter a stall configuration, which is where it's falling down backwards and in a way parachutally coming straight down. Now, the pilot's not very high. He's maybe 50 feet off the ground. I wish the ground was in sight in this moment and I had been there to see, but I would say he's around 50 feet off the ground. He is now in a stall, an unintentional stall. He has to process what's going on and make a decision as to what to do. In this situation, I would argue majority of pilots, including myself, would be so overwhelmed that they would probably perform and do the wrong thing. The pilot, in this case, continued to apply very heavy brake, which kept the glider stalled. I actually think that that was the best thing he could have done, other than maybe throwing a reserve, but there's a few possible options. Let's talk through them. In this situation, a stall, the way of recovering from a stall is to ease your hands up and let the glider regain the air that it does not have, regain the energy, shoot forward, and swing underneath it, filling back full of air. Well, in order for that process to happen, the pilot needs to get their hands up, and more importantly, the glider and the pilot need altitude to do so. At 50 feet, there's a possibility that when it reopened, it dove the pilot straight down into the ground. That is potentially and would have been a far worse situation for this pilot. The pilot would be diving straight down and would have slammed in feet, leg, butt, back first. That would have been very unpleasant. The likelihood of an injury, or even worse, is very high in that situation. Well, the pilot had another option, which is going for his reserve parachute, assuming he's flying with one. The risk with going for the reserve parachute in this situation is that you're going to release one of the two brake toggles, which is going to initiate an even harder spin where one half of the glider, probably the right side, is going to try and fly, spinning you, possibly twisting you up in the lines, or regaining energy and putting you in a dive while you reach for that reserve, which could have been even worse than the final outcome, which is what he ended up doing. That could have been worse. He's high enough off the ground, or around 50 feet, where the chances of that reserve being effective is very slim. Now, a reserve can deploy and be effective somewhere between 50 and 100 feet, but it ultimately depends on how fast you are falling. If you are coming down in a straight down spiral, the likelihood of it opening between 50 and 100 feet is greater because your speed is greater. You are spinning much faster. There's more air to fill up that parachute faster. You're also eating altitude or burning or losing altitude faster, but the likelihood of it opening is greater. He's coming down in a stall, which is not a very fast descent rate. As you'll see or saw, it's not a very fast descent rate. It's fast enough to break equipment and possibly injure you, but it's not fast enough that the reserve is going to have enough time to open at 50 feet. So in my eyes, trying to recover from the stall in this situation or trying to throw a reserve, both could have been far worse than what happened, because both could have put him in a straight down dive towards the ground, which is a very unsafe way to hit the ground. It's a very unsafe angle of attack to make contact with the ground. The third option and the final option, and what the pilot ended up doing, whether intentionally or unintentionally, I would argue unintentionally, just based off how his hands were moving, is keeping the glider stalled. The optimal thing would have been to put the glider in backfly, which is a stalled, very stable configuration that a pilot has to have some SIV experience to know how to get the wing into, but that would be the slowest descent rate in this situation. The second would have just been keeping the glider stalled, which is what he did, where he just descends in a stall and comes down onto the ground. Now, the benefit of coming down in a stall over the prior two things is, number one, your descent rate is a lot slower, and number two, you're actually coming down at an angle where the frame and cage is going to take some of the impact. We hear this term in paramotoring called crumple zone. Ultimately, crumple zone is there on every single paramotor. It's there on every single paragliding harness. It's different. It's not crumple zone. Oftentimes it's an airbag or a foam insert, but it's something underneath the pilot. Crumple zone, in the sense of paramotoring, is the frame and cage below you. No paramotor designs this frame and cage to be there with the intention of absorbing impact, but because of how paramotors have to be designed, they ultimately are a thing. When you come down in a stall and you're coming down slightly backwards and more straight down and backwards, the cage is going to hit the ground first, which is what happened with this pilot. And that is somewhat going to dampen the impact of the crash. I would argue some paramotors are going to do a better job than other paramotors are going to do. No paramotor is going to do a great job, but there is something to make contact with the ground in this case. And those two things are going to lead to the best outcome, which ultimately happened with this pilot. If we keep watching, he's coming down. You can see his hands are very heavy here. We keep going. He makes impact with the frame first and him kind of on the back. There's no good way to come down in this situation. There's no great way to hit the ground, but if you're gonna hit the ground, hitting the ground, moving diagonally to the ground, I would argue, is one of the best ways. The second best way would be to let the cage and frame absorb the impact. Personally, if I'm going to hit the ground in some kind of way, I'm going to try to let the cage and frame take the impact. Every cage, every frame, like I mentioned, has some form of quote-unquote crumple zone, which I don't think is a truly good way of naming what it is, but it is a way. Ultimately, guys, the pilot made poor choices, which led to this situation. It was entirely pilot error. There was no reason to spin a glider in that spot. There was no reason to be that heavy-handed in that spot, especially going light. It was in some way a demonstration of lack of energy management understanding. It's important, if you're flying this aircraft and you're pushing those edges, that you understand how this glider works. Sadly, I see a lot of people out there in, I would say, the intermediate area playing very dangerous games and they don't even realize it. They're very close to this edge and they don't even realize it. If you're yanking around, if you're yanking, spanking, cranking, as I would refer to it, which is low acrobatic maneuvers, you need to understand how that glider moves. You need to understand how the inertia is used to your benefit or against you. In this situation, the pilot made that poor choice of applying heavy brakes at the wrong time. Had the glider been heavily loaded and the inertia had taken him to the left, which was the turn he was making, he could have applied that much brake, no problem, as I'm sure he has in the past many times. But in this spot where the glider is light on energy, applying that much brake is the wrong thing to do. In fact, if he had just let the glider rock forward and initiate its dive downward, he could have applied that brake input. Poor energy management is a big risk. If you're going to be playing low to the ground, please, I encourage you to find some instructor to educate you, teach you, and show you through examples like this, real-world flying, instruction on radio, and all of those techniques, how to safely go about this. The reality is, we as an instructors can say, it is best to not play low like this. It's best to avoid low acrobatic maneuvers. It's best to do what we call low acro. it really is best to avoid low acro. It will increase your safety. You do not put yourself at the risk points. But at the end of the day, a lot of people, majority of people, are going to find themselves doing flying like this. If you're going to do so, please educate yourself on how the gliders work. Please educate yourself on how to safely do this kind of flying. My name is Trevor Steele. I appreciate you guys watching this video. Thank you for watching. I'll catch you guys next time.